Eating disorder recovery may not be top of mind, but you'd be surprised at the percent of midlife women triggered into eating disruption again or for the first time. In this episode, we discuss so much more than eating disorder recovery, and we truly define what is an eating disorder, what is disordered eating versus emotional eating. For every woman who's nurturing herself or others, this episode will have value. I'm Deborah Atkinson. You're listening to Flipping 50, where I address your top struggles and concerns, and I share what to eat, how to move, and how to change your mindset so that you can have the energy and the vitality that you want, need, and deserve in this second and better half. My guest in this podcast is Mindy Gorman-Plutzer. She brings 2 decades of experience to her private practice as a certified functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner and eating psychology coach. Mindy's life experience and training inspired her to create a framework that combines functional nutrition, positive psychology, and mind-body science, introducing a compassionate resolution to physical and emotional challenges resulting from chronic and complex health issues as they relate to eating disorders. She's the author of The Freedom Promise: 7 Steps to Stop Fearing What Food Will Do to You and Start Embracing What It Can Do for You. Can't wait to dive into this episode. We really unpack it all. And again, whether this is you listening so that you can help others, identify it in others, and maybe support them on their journey, or you share it with a friend. And I would be so very grateful if you do. Empowering every woman, not that we are the only gender who's affected by this, but with tools and knowledge to help every other woman and start with herself is something that I believe we can all identify with. Let's dive in. Mindy, I have to welcome you back. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I am so happy to be back with you. I love your topic. I'm crazy about you, and I really cannot wait to dive into our conversation.
Me too. And I want to start really at the very beginning, always the best place to start. But I think for listeners who may be tuning in and may initially look at the title and say, oh, that's not me. That's not for me. I want to really define what it is and what we're talking about. And I truly believe that because so many women do deal with this, many of the women in our audience, if not themselves, may have a younger women that they mentor or tutor or who are watching them, that this will be valuable for every single potential listener. Let's talk about eating disorders and really what falls under that umbrella. Before we go into recovery, what is an eating disorder? What qualifies?
It's such a broad question with an even broader answer, especially within the context and the framework of the culture that we are living in today. Most people think of an eating disorder as representative of somebody who is painfully thin or painfully obese. Technically, that's not really a true picture. Person can be dealing with very serious eating challenges that have led to very serious psychological challenges and be of a quote-unquote healthy, normal weight. And very often, these eating challenges are kept in secret. So I really want to broaden that and make that really a baseline for our conversation today, because we have a term that's thrown around all the time, emotional eating, and I'll dive into my feeling and my observations and my opinion about that. And then we have women that are buried into diet culture. And then we have the other extreme, women who have thrown out diet culture, but they're really following different types of diets by following, eating everything they want. But the clinical eating disorders that we know of that are defined medically are anorexia nervosa, which is defined by a fear of gaining weight. And in most cases, the woman can be painfully thin, medically unstable, requiring hospitalization. And those behaviors, as I said, are not only illustrated by chronic and extreme restricting almost to the point of starvation, but very often there's purging behaviors with that too. Bulimia, where there is purging behavior, and that purging behavior could be any compensatory behavior, over-exercising, laxative abuse, vomiting, but the behavior with food is going to be more of overeating, leading to binge eating, where you eat an exorbitant amount of food in a very short amount of time, being totally disconnected from your body, eating in an effort to numb yourself, to avoid or distract yourself from feelings that you really deem intolerable. And then there is binge eating disorder, which is that same behavior as bulimia, but there is no purging.
Okay. Wow. All right. So I think clinically everyone understands that. I want to also revisit not just defining that, but let's describe who's vulnerable. Who is vulnerable or likely to? I mean, the label you didn't want in high school, most likely to. Talk a little bit about that, and talk maybe about the minute someone comes through in midlife and how that can impact or influence their vulnerability to an eating disorder.
The person who's most vulnerable, and let's talk about women here. Women who define their self-worth by how they look. Women who were given messages early on that their value was determined by how thin they were. Unfortunately, women who have suffered sexual abuse, other kinds of trauma that upset the healthy development of the brain and the body will succumb to eating disorders. Women who are obsessed with their idea of perfectionism. And that's very subjective, so that's why I say their idea of perfectionism will most likely succumb. In my experience, personally and professionally, dieting is the number one precursor to set somebody up for an eating disorder. The obsessive calorie counting, looking at food exchanges, weighing, measuring, getting on the scale is going to lead somebody down the rabbit hole of starting to fear what food will do to them. Now, not everybody who goes on a diet is going to develop an eating disorder, but as I said in my experience, everybody I know, everyone who walks through the door of my office or into my Zoom screen these days, started their eating challenges, their eating disorder, their disordered eating behaviors after finding what they believe to be failures dieting.
Okay. From that, you have just birthed two more questions, or maybe one question, but in two different areas. And I'd love to address these because I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. So in two places, there are things going on right now that are often happening in programs, especially those pertaining to women in midlife, that I'd love your input and feedback about how you feel these come into play. So first, there's the elimination diet.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's fasting, of course, right now that, both hot and trending. And, there is clinical research validating the need for both. So let's just start with one. So first of all, elimination diet. And for listeners, just to be sure you're clear, and I know most everybody knows this, but it is not meant to be a decrease in calories. It's meant to be a swap for foods that are known to be more likely to be sensitivities, flying under the radar, not qualifying as allergies, but still causing gut disturbances or what's known as leaky gut. And because that's so related to hormone health, the gut and the integration of it is more likely that at midlife, a woman can be sensitive to certain foods she previously ate without knowing that. So it's often a phase someone will go through, then go through reintroduction to identify what is happening. It's used like data collection. However, for somebody who already has that kind of heightened radar, Mindy, how could that trigger something, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I prefer to think of an elimination diet as a therapeutic protocol. And I believe that if it is presented the right way, with the right messaging, it can be received and accepted to be such a therapeutic protocol. However, the practitioner who is presenting this recommendation really needs to be aware of her patient and determine ahead of time through history if this recommendation is going to be triggering. I know when I work with a client and I see the need for such a therapeutic protocol, because truthfully, everybody I see has had a very disordered, dysfunctional relationship with food and is suffering from some sort of digestive dysfunction. So there's always the need to address gut health with the population I work with. So what I like to do and how I like to start and how I wish most practitioners would is taking a history, understanding the patient's attachment to their story, their belief system about food, why they're so attached to the foods that they insist on continuing to eat even though they know they don't serve them well on a certain level. So the first thing we need to do before we eliminate foods is to eliminate the toxic and the inflammatory thoughts that they have around their story, their attachment to that story, and what the food is doing for them and what how the behavior is serving them. So there's my take on elimination diets. And again, like so much of what we need to do, is the answer needs to be, it depends. And I'm sure it's the same way for you and you serve, right? When you recommend a program for somebody, you're going to take into account who they are and what might trigger them.
Absolutely. Okay. So great answer, by the way. And I totally agree. I do notice that even some of the coaches and the trainers who are going through our Flipping 50 Menopause Fitness Specialist course have some real issues around that because they're ultra sensitive, because they're doing what they're doing because of their own past experience. That's how they got there. They're wanting to coach other people and spare them or support them by the insight that they have. But I do know that the way it's communicated has to be very customized to the individual receiving it. Let's flip. Okay, so talk to me about fasting.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah. But I just wanted to say to your last point, which is so valid.
Yeah.
You know, we all come to this work with some bias, right? But if we've done the work on ourselves, then we understand that it needs to be presented in a certain light, and we need to really see and feel the person that we're working with, and we're successful when that person knows that they're being seen. So as far as intermittent fasting goes, I personally think aside from the science about all the benefits of intermittent fasting, I think intermittent fasting can be a fantastic tool for somebody who finds herself needing to check out at the end of the day, when she's having trouble being with herself, even though she's by herself. Because when we limit the feeding window, then we are forced to recognize that we can rely on other tools in order to self-soothe.
Love that. I'm just letting that resonate and sit with listeners for a moment, and realizing that we have both a population of women simply in midlife themselves, and we have many who are fitness instructors and health coaches who listen to this one, as well as the She Means Fitness Business podcast dedicated to them. So I'm loving that and hoping it's all resonating with you, and you're realizing, I think individually, we all have also the responsibility to take into account that something may sit with us. We may be interpreting it in one way while the intent wasn't necessarily on delivery, wasn't the same way. And, I think that's like in our personal relationships with significant others, we need to always do that, giving the benefit of the doubt before, realizing how you're going to interpret that for yourself and integrate the actions that you might take based on that. But I love what you've said. And okay, so I'm going to ask you to tackle this bigger one. So fasting is less well defined. There's such a major continuum of what qualifies as fasting. Unpack that a little bit.
Well, there are different methods and different ways to go about it, right? Is that what you're
right.
referring to? There's the 12-hour window of 12-hour feeding window, 12-hour non-feeding window. And for my population of clients, I like to refer to these windows as feeding and non-feeding.
Correct.
I think fasting can be triggering for some. And then there are those who do the 16-8 windows. And then there's a whole new focus. I think it's, OMAD, 1 meal a day.
Mm-hmm.
So there are all different extremes. And again, we need to understand who we are coaching, who are we counseling, who are we guiding, who are we partnering with. In instances where I have recommended any one of many therapeutic protocols, some being intermittent fasting, I find that the women who are more prone to restricting love it. They love the therapeutic protocol. They love being told what to eat. They want to be told what not to eat. And then the women who are prone to relying on food to get through the day, to get through the night, they have more trouble and they can be more easily triggered.
Although I want to back up just one moment and say this about fasting is a lot less about saying what to eat than in fasting and fed. We're talking just about the window of when to eat and when not to eat.
Yes, exactly. No, but those who are obsessive, they are going to want to know what should I eat during that feeding window, because for them, they fear what food will do to them. And here we're trying to teach them to, as my tagline goes, embrace what food can do for them. But one thing I really want to say that has to be an underlying foundation for this entire conversation, whether you are in the middle of a very seriously medically defined eating disorder or simply have a disordered relationship with food. What is common with all of the women I see that come to me is a disconnect from the wisdom of their bodies.
Yeah, amen. And I think that's true when we're addressing exercise too.
Sure.
Yeah. And another way, of course, you've already alluded to of restricting, but I think for women who food may not be, such a paramount issue, although I find that for most of us, we've had this roller coaster of a relationship with food our whole lives. And of course, unlike cocaine and alcohol, we can't just stop it, so we've got to figure out some kind of a dance that we have with it. But it can be, a binge purge in relationship to exercise or the purpose of exercise in their lives as well. And so very true. Okay. So I think we've done a good job of really defining what are eating disorders. And we have had women come on before, talk a little bit more about emotional eating. Can you distinguish for us what is the difference between that term emotional eating and an eating disorder or disordered eating? So kind of three buckets here.
First, I want to say that there are several types of emotional eating. There is eating in response to an emotion, having a bad day, coming home, reaching for the comfort food of choice, having an argument with somebody, reaching for the comfort food of choice. Then there is eating in an effort not to feel emotion. And there's a very big difference there, because when you're eating in response to an emotion, you're aware and it's easier to stop. When you're eating in an effort not to feel emotion, that's where you go into a haze, totally lose yourself to food, totally give your power to the food, and very often come out of it guilty, shamed, in a haze. And then, however, what I love to introduce to people is the idea of bringing emotion to the table. Celebrating a beloved grandmother's recipe or a holiday tradition. Who hasn't had that extra piece of birthday cake after a meal, even though they're full, just because you're celebrating? So I take notice of that expression, emotional eating, and I think we need to be more definitive about what we're talking about. But to answer your question, emotional eating will lead to eating disorder, disordered eating behavior. It's one of the symptoms of a disordered relationship with food.
Okay, such a great definition. I think we've discussed emotional eating before, but that gives us dare I say, food for thought, right? In terms of really defining it. And yes, like you've said, bringing it, celebrating to the table. And then the other instance, to the far extreme is, somebody dies and we're eating as well. Like, when are we not? Everything in between. So such a great distinction there. What is the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating?
Great question. The clinicians will tell you that disordered eating is an eating disorder to a lesser degree. Maybe there won't be as many serious medical complications. Remember, somebody who is severely malnourished from behaving with food to near starvation is going to suffer from low heart rate, low blood pressure, bone loss, a myriad of issues, low brain cognition, basically the effects of malnutrition. Somebody who is dealing with binging and purging is going to suffer serious health consequences. If they're purging by vomiting, they are threatening the health of their esophagus, threatening the enamel on their teeth, their glands and their and their cheeks get swollen. Um, the list goes on and on and on. And they could be malnourished as well. And of course, somebody who has binge eating disorder suffers the consequences that come from being obese and sometimes morbidly obese. The other thing I wanted to say about bulimia, binging and purging, if you are dependent on laxatives, then you are certainly upsetting the gut microbiome and a little bit gut flora, and you're going to be dealing with terrible bacterial imbalances. So there are serious medical and psychological consequences of a DSM-defined eating disorder. Disordered eating are all of those behaviors, but to a lesser degree. However, my opinion, in my mind, what I've come up with about disordered eating, which a lot of your listeners might relate to, is basically misguided behavior that is driven by misguided beliefs. Right? Seeing things online, taking part in every cleanse that is offered to you from your inbox. Eat this, don't eat that. Getting on the keto bandwagon, the intermittent fasting bandwagon, without realizing that maybe there are issues that your body is going through that can't support such protocols. Right? I mean, if you want to go on keto, you've got to make sure that your liver is functioning okay and you're able to process all of those fats. If you are taking up intermittent fasting, you've got to make sure you don't have blood sugar issues. There are so many things that need to be fussed out before you decide to wrap your arms and wrap your head around any one of these diets. Because in this setting that I'm talking about, this disordered setting, it's just another diet.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's probably the mic drop of the day. Seriously, right? It's just another diet in so many ways. My guess is just, as you were speaking, imagining you, if you open up social media and go there, and I know you're there, so I know you have to somewhat. My guess is there's a lot of like forward or forehead slapping going on because, when I think about the myriad of messages that social memes send, I mean, what do you think about the connection between the more hours a midlife woman might spend on social media and the likelihood that she's flirting with disordered eating or all the way to eating disorders?
There's a huge likelihood. I feel so strongly about the fact that we are immersed in a culture that cares more about comparison than connection. And this also goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning, how a woman is sourcing her self-worth. Recovery, the definition of recovery is to regain what was lost or taken. Now, you can recover your set of keys, your glasses, when you leave them in another room and forget where they are. So when we look at recovery from a health issue, recovery from a disease, an eating disorder, recovery from a disordered relationship with food, it's got to be very nuanced. It's not about weight. It's not about food groups. It's relational. It's about recovering, if maybe for the first time in your life, your relationship to self, because that relationship is reflected in your relationship to everything else. And for midlife women, it's about story. It's about a deeply held belief system. It's about an identity. It's about what got them to this place that they are today, what served them well until it doesn't anymore, what started out as a brilliant solution to navigate a world that they didn't feel safe in, that they had to manage. So it's so nuanced and so bio-individual. And that relationship to self, as I said, is reflected in our relationship to everything else, with the knowledge that our relationship with food, to food, started out minutes after we were born. Our very first experience with being seen, with being nurtured, with feeling safe was when we were wrapped in a blanket and fed. The brain remembers that. Later on, if things don't go so well, and now there's an ego, there's a sense of autonomy, we're no longer dependent on the person who was at one time responsible for our care and feeding. We've got to figure it out ourselves. The brain remembers, I want to feel safe, eat, feel better. That's why food is such a big issue for so many people.
And such a challenge to overcome. All right. And I think you may have just already given me the answer, but I'm going to ask you now, smack straight on, why do so many eating disorder recovery programs fail?
Because they are not nuanced. They are more about doing recovery instead of fostering being recovered. And we all have to start out doing recovery. Yes, it's true, and it's not easy. I can attest to that personally. But doing recovery is showing up, getting your vitals done, meeting with your therapist, meeting with your dietitian, and essentially you're being told what you need to weigh, how you need to change your thinking, and what you need to eat. It's not sustainable because the issues of what is going on in there from a functional perspective, the gut health, how the gut is impacting the brain, and not being addressed. The other thing that really drives me crazy is the concept of an all foods fit diet. The traditional eating disorder recovery programs believe and offer the philosophy that in order to prove your commitment to recovery, you have to be willing to eat everything. Well, somebody that's got a messed up gut is not going to be able to eat everything. And essentially what happens is this patient ends up feeding her anxiety because she's not being given the tools and the nutrition that her body and then her brain needs to function properly.
So well said. So very rich. Mindy, I mean, this has been just gold, I think, for a lot of women to unpack. And I want to ask you this one final question and then definitely point listeners to you, because if not for themselves, and I'm going to ask a rhetorical question of all of our listeners, just to think about during the course of a day, how much time, energy do you spend thinking about what you will or you won't eat? And if that answer is like high or all the time, I highly encourage you to seek out some more information from Mindy, because she's got it, she's been there, and she's doing it for you in this purpose. But quite often, just historically with eating disorders, there often was the telltale sign of, there's a lot of things going on, all of which you've discovered and revealed here, but it's also been related to like situational events, like traumatic things or transitions happening in life, maybe going into puberty where a woman or young woman becomes more aware of her body, maybe doesn't like the changes happening, going away to college. And of course, the transition in menopause causes almost the same feel of lack of control over their body changing. Other situational things, triggers that might be true.
Finding yourself alone, which is a big one for many women in menopause. I had a conversation with a fabulous client yesterday. The difference between being by herself and with herself.
I'm letting that sit. It was very rich.
We need to learn that we can be with ourselves, that there is a place within us. I call it my sacred space of serenity that I can always return to. We all have that place within us where there is no fear, there is only love, that we can depend on constantly, where we can find the little girl who didn't feel like she belonged and wrap our arms around her and let her know what we know now with love and compassion. And that's one of the hardest things for women to do when we get to midlife, because for many of us, we're so used to taking care of others. For those of us who spend so many years giving of ourselves to a family, a career, or both, it's very hard to ask for what we need, because somewhere along the line, we figured out, well, maybe I don't have that many needs, or I'll take care of it myself. And then we get to midlife and we're tired and we want the attention and we want someone to wrap their arms around us. And if food has been a means of self-soothing and you find yourself embarrassed, guilty, ashamed, and you're carrying the secret, the challenge is even greater. So that's where we need to learn to ask for support. Healing doesn't happen in a vacuum.
So rich. All right, Mindy, there are a lot of people here who are dealing with themselves or mentoring others and know it or want to be more aware of what to watch for, what to do, how to take action. Where's the best place for a listener to connect more with Mindy?
I would love to send our listeners to my website, thefreedompromise.com. There they will find a drop-down of freebies. One of them is my guide to food freedom, where I share my story. I introduce you to my signature framework, 7 steps to stop fearing what food will do to you and start embracing what it can do for you. And with your permission, that will get you on my mailing list, and you can get announcements from me, invitations from me, and tons of food for thought.
Awesome. So valuable. And I can't thank you enough for being here. Listeners, it's your turn. I'm going to guess that you've got questions or you will have comments about this episode. I'd love to hear from you. If this was valuable, your feedback is so very important. You'll find the show notes and all the links to follow Mindy, not at just what she's just given you, but also to connect with her on social media. So if you're there and you're scrolling, there are some positive messages that you can take in as well. Show notes will be at flipping50.com/eating disorder recovery. And what are you waiting for? Let's start flipping 50 today.